This is the Our York Media Podcast, an audio and video production that features the good news makers of York County, Pennsylvania. I'm your host, Rebecca Hanlon. I'm sitting down today with Ophelia Chambliss. Thank you for joining us today, Ophelia.
Thank you for having me.
Before we jump into our conversation, we do want to thank today's episode sponsor. So York College of Pennsylvania is a private college of more than 4,000 students where from day one, they are given opportunities to grow through project-based learning and connect with the York community so they can have an impact long before graduation. We appreciate York College's support of this program and their commitment to making York a better place. Learn more at ycp.edu. So Ophelia, people may know you from being a local artist and some of the work that you've done with that recently, but it would be great if you could give us a little bit of an overview of who you are, where you came from. So if you have that ready to go. We actually were talking a little bit before we had to start re-recording, so the introduction is a little rehearsed at this point. So you're a pro now.
All right. So I'm originally from Chicago. I grew up on the north side in Cabrini Green Public Housing, one of the largest public housing projects in the country. I attended mostly Catholic schools, went into graphic design, and I worked especially in educational publishing because I was always interested in how people learned through visual images and graphics. I was recruited for a job here in York, Pennsylvania in February of 2000. I was the Vice President of Publishing Services out at York Graphics. I stayed there about a year and a half and then went back to freelance, which is what I was doing before. And I've been doing some teaching and graphic design and mostly fine art ever since.
Okay. So when you came to York, was it on your radar before, or was it primarily just coming out here for the job?
I had no idea that York, Pennsylvania existed
Okay.
prior to coming out here. The only thing we knew about Pennsylvania in Illinois was 3 Mile Island. And
Oh, okay.
so my first thought was to measure how far away that was from 3 Mile Island.
See if you were comfortable enough.
You're right. If I needed iodine tablets or not.
Right.
But no, it wasn't on my radar at all. I was recruited through a headhunter who was looking for an art director and executive in educational publishing or in graphic design.
Okay. So your career at that point, can you give us a little bit more maybe detail on what that was like, specifically to some of the types of work that you were doing out in Chicago?
I worked with the publishing company I worked for was owned by Chicago Tribune. So I was a member of the National Association of Black Journalists, where we worked through newspaper publishing and tried to train students for journalism.
Oh, cool.
So we worked a lot with that. And then I worked in educational publishing. So I worked for a couple of publishing companies that did textbooks from everything from kindergarten all the way through college and high school.
Okay.
Produced a lot of literature books. And I did a lot of illustrations and the graphics for those textbooks.
Oh, cool. Okay. So how did that kind of relate to the work that you ended up doing here in York?
So the company I came here to work for was a publishing services company, meaning they did the work for publishing companies in terms of the editing and the page layout and the graphic design. And so when the publishing company didn't have in-house personnel, they farmed those things out. So they did work for multiple publishing companies across the country.
When you first came to York, what was it like for you?
It was different.
Yeah.
Chicago is a huge, progressive, diverse, very active cultural place, where York was different. A little slower, a little smaller, well, a lot smaller. And the pace was different and the environment was completely different. But I saw a lot of interesting things about it because I had a choice to move back to Chicago when I left York Graphics, but I decided to stay here.
Oh, okay. How long had you been here at that time that choice came up?
Less than 2 years, so it was about 18 months.
So you were early into it.
Yes.
Early on, what was it that kept you here?
Early on, one, I'd moved my daughter here, who was in middle school at that time, and I thought, well, she trusted me enough to make this move without too much complaining. I didn't want to have to move her again, although my agreement with them was that they would make me whole and move me back.
Okay.
But I also saw a great deal of potential here. I saw some communities that were on the brink of change. I saw lots of change happening, and I felt like it was small enough that you could make a difference, and I wanted to be a part of that.
That's cool. So it sounds like some of the arts were part of your career
Correct.
for a while. How did that morph over time?
I have always wanted to be an artist from very early on. As the earliest I can remember is like third or fourth grade. So there's always been some art component to everything that I've done. I've never actually worked in retail or in food industry. I've only had jobs related to art. I think the segue into being more fine art based, a lot of that came out of being here in New York, because I was able then to speak and communicate and address issues in a visual format.
Okay. Had art for you, you mentioned kind of early on knowing that you wanted to be an artist. Was it the kind of artist that you think you are now, or what was the idea of art that you had as a child?
One of my earliest memories of wanting to be an artist was I always wanted to do something that was like socially relevant. I remember telling my teacher that I wanted to teach art to Native American children on the reservation.
Okay.
So I think it's actually a good fit and a good comparison to the type of art that I do now, because I want it to be kind of socially responsible and have this message and the kind of make this world a better place kind of art.
So in what ways, when you were here living in New York, so I imagine you were doing freelance at the time, was that a time when you saw that art kind of grow for you?
Before I moved to York, I did a lot of graphic design and did a lot of illustration, and I painted. I painted pretty pictures. I work in primarily a realistic cubism style. One of the most significant changes in my work after coming to York was the subject matter changed. It became more socially conscious and became somewhat about race. One of the very first exhibits that I had here in York, there were people because they thought, oh, we have a Black artist in town, let's have this art exhibit of her work. And I overheard two people talking saying, which her work isn't Black enough. I expected something different. So I started exploring this whole idea of, well, how can my work not be Black enough? And then what constitutes Black art? Is it the content of the art itself because it's not culturally based, or is it the ethnicity of the artist? So that actually shifted my work, because prior to that, race was not an issue in the work that I did.
About what timeline was that?
2001.
Okay.
Yes, so within that first year.
Yeah, that's pretty early on.
Yes.
How did that really influence you? Because that's kind of a tough subject to look at then, in terms of even your own creations.
Right.
So how did that influence what you did from that point on?
Well, it really underscored that there were issues of race here in New York, that they thought they had this Black artist and her work should look Black. So then to start thinking about then what is
that?
Looking Black, and what does that mean? So I started to then depict representation of African Americans. I started to depict them in my work, cultural representation of that in multiple scenarios, having discussions around that. So changing the narrative of what art is and what Black art is. As a cubist, there was no denotation of race within my work, but I felt like with that issue coming up, here was an opportunity to have that conversation in a place that actually needed it.
Did you find that you were yourself kind of defining then what Black art was, even maybe just for you?
I believe I was, because I had opened up that discussion, and I'd had presentations and group discussions and several dialogues about it. So I do feel like it helped define it for me and what I was doing with my work. I have a master's degree in communications and a bachelor's degree in communication. The two are different. And my specialty is on visual rhetoric. So it's the content of the visual image and the power of it as a means of communication. So, and I believe like it's a language within itself. And I always use the idea that if you're 2 years old and you cannot read, if you're 90 and you're functionally illiterate, if you're from another country and you don't understand our language, we can all look at a visual image and pretty much get that same message. So I thought it would be great to take this new language, this visual communication that I have, and then talk about, race and in some very normal scenarios.
So at that time, what did that conversation look like through your work?
Early on, some of it stemmed from what came up with the Charlie Robertson trial. So looking at conflict, looking at issues of unrest, looking at diversity and discussion. It slowly became more about celebrating, the Blackness, celebrating and talking about the history and putting things in context. Talk about, neighborhoods and individuals, and that people had parties and birthdays, and putting things in context in the history of York, because they'd been very separate.
Over time, so we're talking early 2000s that journey kind of started for
Yes.
you. How did it develop over the years?
It developed into showing those representations, which started off being initially, like I said, unrest and race, and then it became a cultural representation about the richness of a culture, and then it segued into an exhibit that I put together called Casting Shadows, where we stand in the light, we cast a shadow, where it talked about filling in the gaps in Black history, and especially York's Black history.
Yeah.
Instead of just talking about emancipation and civil rights and Barack Obama, what about, the group of individuals who came here in 1827 and the households that they set up, the land that they owned, the businesses that they owned. Talked about different neighborhoods and parties and events and organizations and the strength of these organizations, so that we had different things to talk about in York's Black history instead of just the three things that people tend to focus on.
Kind of more of a local focus on it as opposed to this national wider conversation.
Exactly. Right.
How did you, you weren't from here. You were still fairly new to York even at that point. So how did you yourself learn about some of that culture and history that York had?
I think because I'm not from here, I had to ask a lot of questions, meet a lot of different people, and intertwine into several different neighborhoods and communities to get that information. I've been doing some work with the History Center, and I've been conducting interviews and just going to people, meeting them where they are, having these conversations, asking them stories about their memories. And again, it's all about that narrative, letting them tell their story from their point of view. A lot of these stories and interviews are based on the West African folktale that says the tale of the hunt will always glorify the hunter until the lion has his own storyteller. So giving them an opportunity to tell their memory of what this particular incident or, growing up in this community was, so that we have a bigger, broader, more comprehensive picture.
What are some things that you've heard from people that stood out to you?
Just interesting things about really strong communities and families, a lot of family pride. I've had a lot of people say to me that, I have some stories to tell, and I could write a book, and I want to write a book. And I'm finding something very interesting about that people have these memories and these stories that they think are book worthy, or that they feel should be told or should be shared. And to me, that's valuable when somebody feels like they've had these experiences that need to be part of some public record.
Yeah.
So I think that's powerful. So I've had lots of those conversations, and I've got like 5 or 6 people who want me to write books for them. I'm not a writer, I'm an artist, but I'll gather these information, and everyone's very happy to share, and tell these stories. And there've been some really amazing and some interesting stories.
How do those stories convey then into the work that you do? You've been collecting that information. Yes. So then what do you do with it?
So I've been collecting the information, making all the stories. I'll collect information. I might hear names. I might hear activities and things. I'll go then and dig into the research, go through some of the History Center archives, go online, look at some of the news archives, and build context around it. There are some images out there, and then being able to fill in the gaps and put names to those images and make a more comprehensive story. To be able to put some context to, I was looking at an image earlier today of the 6 gentlemen who worked for the York Ice Company, and they had their names, and the company owner was quoted as saying, "These guys do a lot more than just keep this place clean." And I took that and related it back to just a story growing up with my father. And he worked at a clothing manufacturer, worked there for some 40 years. And he started there as a maintenance guy, but he'd been there so long, he learned how to fix the machines and do all of these things. But to us as a family, that was great income. That was steady income. It allowed him to send his kids to Catholic school. He took pride in the work that he was doing. So while from the company owner's point of view, saying that these were good guys and good employees, and we gave them company uniforms, from their point of view, this allowed them to support their family and to be able to do these things and go on family picnics and go visit family in the South every year.
Other side of the story.
Exactly.
Yeah. You've done quite a bit of work, I think, recently, kind of continuing some of these discussions. I know you had exhibit at your college's Center for Community Engagement that was in there for a while, and you have studio space in Market View Arts.
Yes.
How long have you been in that space?
I've been in Market View. It'll be 2 years in October.
Oh, okay.
Yes.
Okay. Is that for you, was that kind of more of a new permanent space, or had you been in studios before?
That is the first time that I've actually ever been in a studio. Okay. I'd always worked from my home studio, which I loved. And I used to tell myself, but then I can paint anytime I wanted to. If I wanted to go down or stay down in my studio until 2, 3 o'clock in the morning, I can paint whatever I wanted to. So being away from home is really inconvenient. And I had to stop and ask myself, well, how many times have you actually gone down there at 2 o'clock in the morning, Or how many times have you started painting but you decided to unload the dishwasher first or put away the laundry first? So I really didn't think that working at a studio away from home was going to work, but it has been amazing.
Nice.
I produce so much work, and because when I'm there, that's all that I do.
That's all you're going to do. Yeah. How has that relationship spurred, because you mentioned York History Center is kind of one that you work with in helping gather information of actual pieces of history that maybe weren't recorded before, that weren't kept record of. How does your relationship with the college and having, the opportunity to kind of showcase some of that in a level there relate to the messaging that you continue to do?
I think I'm trying to think of the order of events here. I came up with the idea to do the project prior to having the studio at Market View and prior to doing any work for the History Center. So it's all became an offshoot of that. I think the first thing that started with that was a project that I actually did in Gettysburg, where I created, there are 3 towers, they're permanent art installation pieces dedicated to United States colored troops. And it's the first monument that's actually dedicated to the colored troops as part of Gettysburg tours. So now it's on the tours. And it's also on the Commonwealth's Historic Marker and Database site. So I started doing research when I worked on that project. And then I was nominated by the governor to be on the commissioner's board for the Pennsylvania Historic Museum Commission. So I got deeper into the history and the research. So it was really an interesting segue. I didn't start out with this plan, but it was one thing kind of led to the other. And then, so doing this work after doing the research in Gettysburg and then getting on the commission just made sense to come up with this project. And then it made sense to kind of connect that to the History Center. I think one of the significant pieces of it being at the Center for Community Engagement, the former Lafayette Club, was that, the Lafayette Club didn't have its first African-American member until 1998, which is like yesterday, which is astounding. So it was important to change the face of that space and allow the Black community to see themselves in that space.
And can you give us a little bit of background on the actual series that you had in there? What inspired those pieces?
Those pieces were inspired just by the research, and my plan was to go across history and make it very chronological. So I started with some of the earliest things that I can find of African Americans being in York County. And so some of the first things were in the early 1800s with a significant group of people in 1827. And I even painted them chronologically. So the very early ones were in sepia tone, and then I segued into black and white and then into full color.
Okay. What were some of the things that you hope to be able to convey through those?
I wanted to convey this chronological aspect, like there are things that are happening over time, and that these things are happening in between the gaps. So in between emancipation and civil rights, there's a whole bunch of stuff happening, a lot of positive stuff. So I really wanted it to be pointing out the positive and the celebration, and letting people of color just be people of color, and it's not always about, race. They have parties, they have events, they have picnics, they have family reunions, and it's not like, oh, they're having a black family reunion or they're having a black this. No, they're just having it, just like everybody else is having it.
Yeah. You've also done quite a bit of work within particular communities and neighborhoods. You have murals that have gone up. How did those things come about, and why did you decide that you were going to do those?
A lot of these ideas come about in the middle of the night. I'll have this idea when I'm sleeping, and I'll wake up and go, oh, here's an idea. I think I'm going to do this. And then once I say that, then I have to do them.
Yeah.
So it's just... And very often people say, well, what's your subject matter, or what inspires you? And I have to just say it's the human condition. And it might have been something that I'd seen or encountered or heard that gave me an idea. And then I try to figure out a way to make that happen. One of the ideas that I came up with, besides the changing the narrative or the casting shadows, was the Contiguous project, where I really wanted to, because I'm freelance and independent, I feel like I meet and see and interact with more groups of people and organizations than the average person who goes, this is where I work, these are my friends. But because I'm not connected to anything or anybody, I kind of see them all. And there were a lot of people who I felt like, I don't think you realize what you have in common with this person over here, or how you guys are all connected. So Contiguous was an opportunity to bring all those people together who I've met in different places, who I thought should know each other because you would really like them or find something interesting and new. And Contiguous it's a continuous line, or something neighboring. And in theory, I could put the pencil down on the paper and draw this person and never lift the pencil from the paper, and then draw the next person and the next person, and all 60 of these individuals are connected by one continuous line.
Very cool. You have also participated in other people's art or expressions of Black art, I would say. And what comes to mind for me is Richard Craighead and the photo series. And I'm going to blank on, there's a name for that.
That is called assemblage.
Yes.
So assembling people together.
You participated in that. Can you give us a little, and we have to have Richard on to talk about it, but can you talk a little bit about your involvement in that? Because you've been part of other people's kind of expressions of art.
Yeah, I feel a responsibility to share and encourage other people to use their art as a tool to make things better. I like a lot of the things, the ideas that Richard has. So the exhibit that's coming up is called Becoming and Assemblage. So the Becoming portion of it is their portraits done by the 2019 Appel Fellow, Lexis Gore. And she put together a group of questions, and we worked on some ideas kind of based on Michelle Obama's book Becoming, to where these 12 women answered questions about what does it mean to be becoming a woman, and what are some of the aspects of that, and who are, or what is the woman that you're becoming now, and had them answer those questions, and she did a portrait of them. So that's one part of the exhibit. And then Richard's assemblage, where he pulled together groups of people of color, African Americans, Hispanic, whomever, to take these photographs, and they just happen all to be dressed in Black, but to really see a certain amount of strength in that gathering. Lexis's portraits, they're African American, Hispanic, Vietnamese, I think one Chinese, but women of color. Yeah. So it's an interesting collaboration, and I thought it would be perfect to put the two of them together in this exhibit.
It sounds really cool. When you kind of look back on that early time when that comment was made about your art maybe not being Black enough, to maybe an overarching picture of what that art scene looks like now in York, what have you seen in terms of changes?
Well, even just looking at the murals of York, and looking at, other than the William Goodrich piece, which I have a number of problems with, you did not see a representation of people of color throughout York. People don't realize that murals or art in the public space has a certain responsibility. That's representation, that's semiotics, that when you have art in a public space, it's supposed to reflect the people there. If you think of it in archaeological terms, 500 years from now, if someone were to unearth York from its rubble, they need to be able to look at those murals and say, who lived here and what did they do here?
Learn something about it.
Exactly. But right now they would look and go, well, they were still living in 1930. So I think now we have more of a representation, that it's a more diverse community. And I think some of the work that I've done has helped to help visualize that. And
what are the neighborhoods that your work is really publicly visible in? There's one on Pine Street.
Right. So that mural on demand program that I've been doing. So prior to that, there was the steel structure on the corner of Queen and Princess Street that I did that reflected that community, and they had input in it. I'm currently working on a wave piece that's going to go on the east end of town called the Wellington Wave. Hopefully we can get it in that neighborhood. I just need a wall, somebody to okay that. I wanted Northeast Neighborhood Association, and then one more someplace probably on the west end of town. And I did that because I wanted murals and representation, not just in the square, not in downtown proper, but out in the neighborhoods where people lived.
Yeah. What do you think that will do?
I think it will give people a sense of belonging to York City. There are people who live in York City who do not come downtown York City. And we're talking just a few blocks away. And I wanted then to kind of make that downtown bigger by making it part of that murals of York. And then those murals of York represent them, because each of those murals, they actually have an opportunity to do some of the painting for those murals. So not only is it just, we're not just throwing something on the wall in your neighborhood, you're a part of this. You have a buy-in, and you can have your hand in here.
I think you obviously have this component of education in what you do. How do you incorporate that into this really kind of hands-on engaging thing with, because you have Lexus that you've mentored and even Richard. What is it that you hope to kind of instill in them as they are uncovering additional stories and representing people through art?
And that's important. I have a lot of young people who I am kind of mentoring right now, who I really want them to recognize that their art, their craft, the thing has power, and that they should use it, and then really showing them how to use it, so that the work continues, and that we're able then to kind of not so much start a movement, but there's this wave that's going through of these young artists of color, are able then to express themselves and have this. So I really work at teaching them to be professional about it, teaching them to position themselves in places they normally would not go, how to articulate their work, and how to represent, basically.
Yeah. You mentioned in some of the work that you did related to some of the history of York, having conversations about these are just families that are doing family things. These are communities that do community things. What do you think when we take that story into, more modern times, that those conversations need to continue to be about?
That's really important, because I don't want it to be just a history thing.
Yeah.
I'm also looking at some of the stuff that's happening now. I kind of organized a Black Film Coalition so we can get people seeing films and having conversations. And they're all supposed to be feel-good films, the kind of things that we grew up with, but also trying to get young folks interested in then going to the Appel Center and seeing films. So it really is, it's all about trying to get people to go places and do things they haven't done before, or getting familiar with or comfortable in those spaces, feeling welcome there. And that's a big part of what representation is about. If you see something that looks like, feels like you're going to be more apt to walk through those doors. But if it looks very threatening, it's like, nah, you don't belong.
Right.
So trying to open that up and give more people an opportunity to do that, and then getting younger folks to kind of carry that banner as well.
What are next things for you?
I don't know. My plan is I said that I was going to stop doing issues around, and they're really not around race. They're just about normal stuff, about people, mixed groups of people doing things together. So I will always continue to promote diverse events and diverse activities. The next project I have kind of coming up on the radar is a timeline where I take all of York's history and all of York's Black history and all of York's Hispanic history and all cultures and backgrounds and put it on the same timeline and put it in context. So while this family group, maybe the Saltzgivers were over here having a family reunion and picnic, the Keenheels were also having a picnic, and they were having it up the street from you. And so really giving people an idea of how things fit, in a timeline, and that, wow, they're doing the same things that we're doing. Or while this was happening to us too. So I think it just really kind of smooths out those differences and builds that commonality. I always find it interesting. I saw this meme where it said that Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and Anne Frank and Barbara Walters were all born in the exact same year, but you don't see them along the same timeline. So I wanted to put them in context.
That's interesting. You have kind of talked a little bit about, this journey that you've taken in this career and staying in York. Do you think when you made that decision to stay in York, you weren't going to move back to Chicago or go anywhere else? Do you think you made a good decision that you stayed here and did what you wanted to do?
I think I made a good decision. Originally, it was, to stay until my daughter graduated from high school. And the minute she graduated, she headed back to Chicago so fast.
Oh.
But now, I'm going on my 20th year. And like I said, I am kind of done with some of the discussions that I've been having with my work. I am going to be changing what I'm doing with my work, going back to my original style of cubism and dualism and things like that. And it's not going to be about Blackness or Black representation, kind of the stuff I did when I first got here. Trying to show at galleries outside of the area. So I do plan on taking that bigger step. Whether or not that's going to keep me here or not, I'm not sure. But yeah, I plan to do more with that.
Is that art that's more for you as opposed to maybe this bigger mission or message that it's kind of, Ophelia getting back to the art that you want to do?
Yes, my personal art, the things that I'm drawn to express. But I don't know, maybe I won't get there. Maybe I feel like I want to get back to my personal art, but maybe my mission is to always continue to champion or have this cause. But I think at some levels, it's to do this on a bigger scale, not just here in New York, because I think it's a conversation that other communities probably would like to have. I could probably see myself doing more speaking to the art or having the conversations with that, focusing on what I'm trained in as far as the communication and communication theory ideas of representation and semiotics.
Very cool. Well, thank you so much for coming on and giving us some background on all of that. I know I learned more than I knew before, so I really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Thanks so much for listening. For more information on Our York Media and our Good News Initiative, you can visit ouryorkmedia.com. We appreciate your attention and give bonus points for those who subscribe. Special thanks today for our episode's sponsor, York College of Pennsylvania. The Our York Media podcast is produced by Will Hanlon and Caleb Robertson. I'm Rebecca Hanlon. Thanks so much for listening.